First thing you gotta do before you can swap the coilovers is lift up the truck so you can take the wheels off. Put the jack directly underneath the skid plate. There's a raised circle right in the back of the skid plate that is reinforced up against the frame. Maybe put a piece of wood in between the two so you don't scratch the skid plate, and then position the jack stands so that when you let the truck down it rests on the frame rails. With the weight of the truck on the wheels, loosen the lug nuts, and then put a bottle jack underneath that lower control arm so you can actually take the wheel off once you've loosened the lug nuts slightly. And then once the wheels are off, you can get to the actual first portion of removing and swapping the coilovers. So this 19mm bolt, you'll want to take off, maybe like loosen 1/4 inch. Yeah, so that you can actually get some distance between the upper control arm and the spindle down there where it connects via the ball joint. You can use a ball joint remover and a hammer. It's easier to use a combination of both as opposed to using one or the other. Just make sure you don't tear that rubber boot on the ball joint. As long as you left some space between the nut and the bottom of the spindle, once the ball joint comes loose, it's pretty obvious. Okay. And then to give yourself more clearance before you start pulling on the brake lines, undo this pair of 10mm bolts. One's on the upper control arm. Kind of dangle it out of the way. And the other one's on this little bracket that connects the soft brake line to the hard line. And then the other side routes the ABS line over to the brake sensor. So undo both of those. And then the last thing is a little tab, this little tab in here. And if you undo this, then you'll get some more slack with that brake line, with the ABS line. And that's what you need the screwdriver for. And you won't be able to take out the bottom until you get the lower control arm fully drooped and take the bolt out. Am I blocking the camera too much?
Yeah, it's okay. We'll get a shot up in there.
Pop this out with the screwdriver, pry it open, and you can pull just a little bit more slack out of here so that when this drops and the upper control arm wants to slide up and the lower control arm wants to drop down once you lower the jack, then you're not yanking immediately on brake lines and ABS wires. While everything's still supported, nothing's really moved a whole lot, you can continue to loosen the bolt that holds in the lower end of this coilover, and then it's 14mm nuts up on the top. The threads are pretty long, you'll need a deep walled socket just to get the nut started, but from that point it's easy to just finger loosen the rest of the way. All of the coil tension is pushing upwards, so the coil's not going to drop out immediately until you actually take out the bottom. Down here you'll take, it's a 19mm, it's a 19mm nut with a washer that comes off of this. So take that off. And then the jack that's holding the lower control arm from dropping down. So already gotten these ABS lines loosened, the brake line don't really mess with, especially because there's hard lines on either side. If you're doing this job by yourself, this is the point where you could tie some thick gauge mechanics wire between these 2 points to keep the spindle from dropping once you actually loosen the ball joint. Not sure what happened to the audio here, but we're just continuing to take the nut off the ball joint while applying some downward pressure on the upper control arm. Be careful about letting them come apart. Hold on to that spindle so that the spindle is not hanging off the brake lines. Okay, so that's being supported so there's not tension on the brake line. And then just tap this bolt through. Comes in from the back and goes out the front. You have to put it back in same way. That's out. So you can see this is loose now. So I took that bolt out, which makes it so this can go loose. So the only thing holding it in from the top is those 3 nuts up there. Just turned down the original video because there's a lot of background noise. At this point I'm just working on taking off the 3 nuts on top of the coilover so that it'll actually drop down since the bottom's loose. Having 2 people made this easier for sure, but you can get this all done by yourself if you just tie right there where my wife's holding onto the spindle. If you tie that to the upper control arm, it'll accomplish kind of the same thing, just with one less set of hands. You don't need to raise the lower control arm back up. I'm just doing it so I can reattach the ball joint and then talk through some more of the installation details. But from this point you can just go straight to installing your aftermarket coilover without having to raise that lower control arm back up. This is going to be part of the shock that faces outwards, and you want the long end forward, at least on the 4Runner, the short end on the back. And then once you have those bushings in the correct place, then it's just the 3 nuts on top that you reattach to that seat, and then the original bolt on the bottom. Forgot to mention earlier, but it's probably a good idea to swing that sway bar end link up out of the way. Just don't forget to put it back. It's not required, and you can swing it back down with the coilover in. You just have to do it before you lower the upper control arm back onto the spindle. I'm moving the upper control arm back separate from the spindle so we can actually get the coilover back in there. Pull this down. I had the lower control arm lifted up to help match up to where the upper control arm was. So now just lowering it back down to get full droop of suspension so we can actually get the coilover back in.
still got space on these lines.
Once the lower control arm is fully drooped, you'll actually be able to get the coilover installed. There's in the bottom and in the top. Lower control arm enough, you should be able to get this to line up. And once it's lined up, you gotta make sure you're putting it in the correct side. Back first. So finish threading this bolt through. Once it's through, then you'll put the nut. The washer and nut back on. Doesn't have to be super tight yet, but once that's on, then you can start raising the lower control arm again. Just making sure that these are tight so the shock is in position. And then this, back to this. Raise the lower control arm. And then get these lined back up. Once they're close, then you should be able to pull the upper control arm down to line up with the spindle. And get it started, and then that will hold. Use the jack to bring it up a little further. Now it'll just be tightening these. Lost audio here as well, but with the aftermarket coilover, we got a lot more clearance above, so you can easily get a ratchet in as opposed to just having to use a wrench. So that saves some time in reinstalling those aftermarket bolts into the top of the coilover. Alright, so skid plate relocation bracket. It's got a pair of recessed holes and a pair of threaded holes. Recessed holes are what you put these countersunk Allen head bolts in, and then the new holes that are what you actually attach the sway bar bracket to. The fact that they're forward is what moves the sway bar forward. And like I mentioned at the beginning of the video, this portion would have been easier if I had just taken the skid plate off to begin with. So it's got an L and an arrow pointing forward, so that's the way that you mount it. So with the brace, you gotta put the washers in, and probably a good idea to put the bolt in so that the washers stay where they're supposed to be. So you gotta put it in. The washers don't slide around, and then you have to take it back off and get it. Just temporarily put that on. Then grab 2 more washers. This clip is showing you where all the spacers go for the skid plate brackets. There's 2 on each location for a total of 6 on each bracket. There's also aluminum spacers that go between the skid plate and the brackets themselves. And then the whole point of putting those spacers in the first place is because that sway bar moved forward, and if you didn't lower the skid plate mounting brackets, then the sway bar itself would contact the mounting brackets. So that's what I'm showing, pointing the flashlight at. I'll zoom in here in a second and be able to see a little bit better. So those 2 components would contact each other if it weren't for lowering the mounting bracket slightly with those spacers. Now that you're finished, in order to finish tightening everything back up, tighten that 19mm bolt at the bottom of the shock, the 3/14s at the top of the shock, the 19 that connects the upper control arm to the spindle. That's a 19mm, and you need to recotter pin that bolt. And then there's the pair of 10mm bolts that we took off that attach the bracket to both the upper control arm and the spindle and hold the ABS wires in position. So one more time, it's the 3/14mm bolts at the top of the shock, the 10mm bolt that holds this bracket on for the ABS wire, this 19mm nut for the ball joint, this 10mm bolt for the second of the 2 brackets for the ABS wire, the bolt that holds the sway bar onto the sway bar end link, and then all the bolts required to reposition your sway bar forward. Make sure you're bringing the truck in to get in alignment, because with you adjusting the height, the toe and the camber are going to be out of alignment. But with the stock upper control arm, they're not going to be able to do anything about the caster angle.